Hi, welcome to the next lecture in the Existentialism course, Philosophy 3511. This one's simply entitled The Individual. We have looked at the early sources of existentialist thought, starting with Socrates and Aristotle, and then most recently the medieval contributions from religious thinkers. And we're trying to sort of see the similarities between the pursuits we normally call religious and those of the existentialists. And while we typically stereotype existentialists as atheists, their concern, whether they're theists or atheists, is very similar. That is, both to each other and to the religious, at least in the Judeo-Christian sense. Because the concern is throughout what Socrates would have called a concern with one's character or soul, and what the religious will often characterize as their relation to God. Now, if we think of God as a metaphysical entity that's outside the world, then a personal relationship with God seems like an odd thing for anyone to be concerned with. But if we ask why anyone would have such a concern, and followed people, say in the Platonic tradition, who thought they had a metaphysical or non-physical soul, then the likeness between the soul and God would be one clue. But even then, you might ask, well, why would anyone be concerned to match up or see how they are related, this metaphysical soul and the metaphysical concept they have of God? And then, of course, if we were to take the concept of God out of the picture, one is sort of left with, thrown back on oneself as the only theoretically metaphysical entity that there is. Other than, say, something like numbers in mathematics, which the Pythagoreans and Plato were on about. But that doesn't provide the sort of consolation or even identity that one seeks when one tries to find answers to theological questions. So we've looked at those in order to get a better sense of what existentialism means apart from its sort of cliches of berets and cigarettes. And around the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the modern period, we start to see people who, like Pascal in the last lecture, are doing something wherein they're sort of abandoning the Enlightenment project of gaining knowledge rationally and pursuing through what we would typically call faith, something which they feel can't ever be known rationally, especially when it comes to knowing oneself. And so from that point, we can see sort of a definite shift toward a concern for the individual, as we saw last time, for the subjective over the objective. Now, in modern times, here we're talking about the early 1800s, the figure who stands out as the person most regarded as the founder of modern existentialism is a man named Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, and one might even say theologian, from Copenhagen, of a wealthy family there, whose single aspiration was to become an individual, to stand out from the crowd, so to speak. And we can think of him as actually after the modern period, since that ends with Kant. But since this is still, or let's say already a couple of centuries ago, the word modern sounds strange for some people. He's certainly not contemporary. But he begins the sort of the 20th century, let's say, movement that will become existentialism. So Kierkegaard is interesting in that he's not only a theist, he's adamantly interested in being one. In other words, he's very concerned that one not go through the motions of religious belief, that one not act as if one's religious, but that one be that, and is very focused on the difference between the two. So his writings are on a number of topics: religion generally, what he called Christendom, sort of the organized aspects of religion, morality and ethics, and what some people regard as simply human psychology. And so the idea is, how can I create something like a single individual, knowing that I'm getting all of the contributions from the society around me, and knowing how likely it is that I'm going to assent to what others think or what others appear to want me to think, etc. And he's very critical of the philosophical systems going on at the time, particularly that of Hegel, and I'll come back to that. But the idea is, if you've got institutionalized systems, whether they're religious or philosophical, they're precisely going to inhibit the individual, or they're going to make claims about how the individual fits like another brick in the wall into a system, so that its identity is known in relation to everything else, rather than as each individual knows him or herself from the first-person point of view. Now, he comes from, as I said, a wealthy family. Both of his parents, though, are dead by the time he's in his 20s. And as you can see by his dates here, he only lives to his early 40s. Not a very healthy person. Claimed to have a very odd posture, odd appearance. Some thought him a very handsome man, as you can see from this picture. At least this depiction expresses that. And so it's very odd to think of a young man, at least these days, let's say, who might have been found attractive in any way, who's wealthy, to be concerned with these kinds of things. Usually we think of religious occupations sort of developing as one ages and thinks about their own mortality and those kinds of things. So Kierkegaard is an odd person, and his name in Danish would translate to English as something like churchyard. And of course he's steeped in the religion, the Christianity of his period, and as a result is very preoccupied with whether one is being what one would call a good or a genuine Christian. Now, throughout his life, he kept journals. He wrote over 7,000 pages of journals about a number of things: Danish society, life there in Copenhagen, the Christians around him. But as you can see from this excerpt, his main preoccupation is himself and his relation to God. So he says in this one journal entry, what I really need is to get clear about what I must do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. And this is important almost in the sense we saw with Aristotle. Unlike traditional Western philosophy, where knowledge has to precede an act in order for the act to even be considered an act, here the emphasis is on what we would typically in a religion call faith. Knowledge isn't unimportant, but its usefulness, as he says here, is really determined by whether or not it can function as part of the process of becoming an individual. As he says, what matters is to find a purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. The crucial thing is to find a truth which is truth for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. Now, this isn't the sense in which philosophers mean truth. This leads to the kind of thing that they refer to as relativism. Truth for oneself doesn't really amount to truth. It's got to be compared to other people's beliefs, how the world itself is, etc. But for those concerned with subjectivity, like Kierkegaard, what matters is what oneself takes to be true. And not true in the sense of correspondence to reality, true in the sense of identity, intuition, almost in the Socratic sense of conscience. So when he says here that I want to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. One might think, well, you'll never know what God wants, or as theologians might do, one can spend one's whole life trying to figure out how one could ever know what God wants. But here, he seems to be referring, as Socrates did, to God as his conscience, so that the way I find out what's right for me is through what some people today might call my God. If there's such a thing as God, it's not supposed to be individual. There should be only one of them. So when people use this kind of terminology or suggest this kind of conception of God, it seems to mean more like what in my innermost being I feel is right, and that they're equating with what God wills for them. Now, in addition to all those journals, Kierkegaard generated an enormous amount of published writing as well, of completed books. And what's strange for someone who's concerned to become an individual is that he wrote these books, almost all of them, under pseudonyms. And his early work was written under various pseudonyms that he used to present distinctive viewpoints. In other words, he's talking about a subject and will present different sides from different points of view, so that almost like characters in a book, the books can interact with each other in something like a very complex dialogue. So the more that he writes, the more something like the inner life of a mind emerges, so that by reading all of the works as well as the journals, you get a full sense of what that self was like, and can think of the pseudonyms as names for the various viewpoints. So he's thinking of these complex problems and wrote what he called many upbuilding discourses under his own name, and dedicated them to what he called the single individual who might want to discover the meanings of his work. Most notably, he wrote, Science and Scholarships wants to teach that becoming objective is the way. Christianity teaches that the way is to become subjective, to become a subject. And so while scientists can learn about the world by observation, Kierkegaard denied that observation could reveal anything about the inner workings of the mind or spirit. So you've got this tension between objectivity and subjectivity, with science being the concern with the former, religion being concerned with the latter, and the tension that develops between the two, especially when emphasis is placed on understanding oneself both with and without reference to the things around one. And to give you an idea of the extent, this is a list of the most important of Kierkegaard's pseudonyms, listed here chronologically. And on the left, you've got, as we'll see in the next slide, the supposed writer or editor of one book, and so on down the list. And it's really not until one has read all of these and understood the various voices with which each position is presented that one has a full sense of what Kierkegaard was basically trying to get at. And if you think of this as facets of one's personality or the voices inside one's head, you can think of this collective work as something like the externalizing of the individuality that Kierkegaard hoped to become. Now, the first of his published works was actually one of his most famous, a book called Either Or, from 1843, and it was written ostensibly by Victor Eremita, which is Latin for victorious hermit, which in effect is what Kierkegaard ended up becoming. The subtitle of the book is A Life Fragment. The book consists of two parts. There's basically two volumes to it. And it outlines a theory of human development in which consciousness progresses from an essentially hedonistic or aesthetic state to one that's concerned with ethical imperatives. So the either or is whether one is going to live a life of pleasure, i.e. hedonism or aesthetics, and or whether one is going to be concerned with the ethos of the community. And so from the very start, Kierkegaard is thinking, is it a matter of being true to oneself, or is it a matter of being true to those around you? And presents it as something like stages along life's way, where in the beginning we're all sort of occupied only with ourselves and our pleasures and doing what we like. And then, of course, we run into the fact that there are other people in the world, and not only do we have to do right by them, but we become concerned with how they perceive us, and whether they like what we're doing, whether what we're doing is right, so to speak. And so the aesthetic is the subjective realm, where the individual living a life of pleasure is constantly enjoying him or herself, but there seems to be limitations to it. There's only so much of a good thing that one can consume without possibly wondering, is there any more to this? And then with the ethical life, there's, of course, constraints on the indulgences that one can allow oneself. And so that struggle of either or, that one has to be either one or the other, is almost something like a typical Christian view of the demon on one shoulder and the angel on the other, where one is having to sort of struggle with what kind of person one's going to become in that sort of simple form of opposition. Now, as you can see, just in this book alone, you have 4 different pseudonyms. The initial one, as I mentioned, is the fictional compiler of the text. The second, simply the letter A, is a name that's supposed to represent the either side. Judge Wilhelm is supposed to represent the or in this dichotomy. And Johannes is the fictional author of the section either, entitled Diary of a Seducer. Now, one of the characters that Kierkegaard uses to sort of epitomize the aesthete, the one who lives for aesthetic pleasures, is Don Juan or Don Giovanni, who is famous for seducing. That's the reason for the Diary of the Seducer. Seducing lots and lots of women, allegedly a 1,003. And the idea is that this kind of thing, of simple repetitive seductions, could go on forever. If one is only living for aesthetic pleasure, then there's really no end to it. It's simply the sort of gratification that any other animal gets, and seems, as we've seen since the time of Socrates, sort of good but insufficient. That there needs to be, somehow or another, a person isn't really a person if they simply go through the motions of getting as much pleasure as they can. Now, on this point, Kierkegaard uses as something like a model or an inspiration an idea from Epictetus, the early Stoic, who said, "You must be one man, either good or bad. You must cultivate either your own reason or else externals. Apply yourself either to things within or without you. That is, be either a philosopher or one of the mob." And so what Kierkegaard seems to think is that in order to be a unique individual, one can't become one of the mob. And so while tracking the ethos of the community matters, if one seeks to be an individual, one has to rise above that, let's say, or while taking into consideration, not let it hinder or hamper one from being true to one's own conscience, or anything like we would have seen with Socrates. So the goal suddenly becomes something like becoming a single thing. If I am living for distinct pleasures, then there's not really a core to my being. If I'm simply responding to the things around me, I'm not doing that either. In one sense, he thinks both of these fall short. It sounds as if one ought to give up aesthetic pleasures and do right by the community. That as one matures, one will see that no man is an island and will start to be concerned with the concerns of others. But Kierkegaard seems to be thinking that both of these are problematical. One could live as a Don Juan, the pleasures needn't be sexual. They could be food or any type of aesthetic enjoyment one gets. Or one could respond to the commands of those around them. But in neither case would one be really sort of building the character that Kierkegaard, like Socrates, is so concerned to do. It's just that in Kierkegaard's case, he's framing it in terms of Christianity. He wants to be a true Christian, and for him that means being the kind of individual that is really only epitomized in someone like Jesus. So that when we think about the split that I mentioned earlier about science being concerned with objectivity and Christianity with subjectivity, where he says a decision in the external sphere is what Christianity does not want. Rather, it wants to test the individual's faith. He's basically saying that when faced with this, much as Pascal had been, the choice has to be in toward oneself, to discover what that is. And the word discover sort of doesn't do justice to it. It has to be both discovery and invention. One is turning back in on oneself not in sort of just withdrawing from the community or from the outside world, but more as a forging of the individual that can be there if one does this kind of thing. It's almost like he's thinking in terms of a loop. Rather than a recluse, he's thinking of it as the active process of becoming someone. In fact, one of the more famous descriptions of this process that Kierkegaard uses is what he calls the knight of faith. Knight in the sense of Cervantes' Don Quixote type character, where one is pursuing what is in one's heart or one's conscience, regardless of whether one is chasing windmills, whether one is crazy, that kind of thing. Kierkegaard's key ideas are something like, as we'll see, truth is subjectivity. So it's not a matter of matching up with what others might think really is the case. The knight of faith is always sort of turning back on oneself to both figure out what one's project will be, what one's passions are, and in so doing go from this aesthetic level to the ethical level to what Kierkegaard views as the religious level. When we get to religion, we're, so to speak, face-to-face with God, but not face-to-face with something outside ourselves, face-to-face within ourselves. And so for Kierkegaard, rather than looking out or just out to Christian God the Father, one is looking into oneself, into one's soul, to find, so to speak, who one ought to be. In addition to Jesus, for this sense of inwardness and this quest that the knight of faith has, Kierkegaard goes back to the figure of Abraham in the Bible. And in another famous book, Fear and Trembling, which he publishes under the pseudonym Johannes de Silencio, that John of the Silence, he uses this title, Fear and Trembling, as an allusion to Philippians, which a passage of which reads, "Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." which is probably itself a reference to Psalms, fear and trembling came upon me. If you think of the history of philosophy as an attempt to gain certainty through knowledge, then you would have something like a stability that would assure you that what you're doing is right or what you're thinking is right. All of the existentialists, but especially Kierkegaard, are thinking that's precisely what I don't want. As soon as I get certainty, I am, so to speak, dead. So it is, or static, let's say. So fear and trembling shows that someone is anxious. And the concept of anxiety is really interesting to Kierkegaard because he thinks that's precisely what faith is about. You don't really know in that sense of philosophical certainty. And so everything you do should be done with fear and trembling. It's almost as if once one realizes that one is alive, then it's not possible not to have this sense of anxiety, this fear and trembling as one looks forward to one's own mortality, realizes that every day matters, that the process of creating a self is unavoidable in Pascal's sense of making this wager, that the dice are thrown and you have to sort of get as involved in the process as you can in order to be the person you, so to speak, will have become. We very often might think, well, I'm already me. I was born me. This notion of what we might refer to as a Cartesian self, a sort of a soul bubble that is distinct unto itself from day one, is precisely what the existentialists are saying is not the case. I am the process of becoming me, so to speak, and take that up as my sole occupation. Now here's a picture of Abraham with his family leaving Ur in the Middle East. And after the preface by Johannes, the book begins like this. Once upon a time there was a man who as a child had heard that beautiful story of how God tempted Abraham and how Abraham withstood the temptation, kept the faith, and contrary to expectation, got a son a second time. Now, in the biblical story, Abraham, who's very old, so old that he had no reasonable expectation of ever having children with his wife Sarah, eventually was granted a son, Isaac, and was ecstatic. And in the story, that is Kierkegaard's story, Kierkegaard is trying to figure out how Abraham became what he calls a father of faith. So something like some version of this knight of faith. And Kierkegaard says, everyone was great wholly in proportion to the magnitude of that with which he struggled. In other words, greatness comes with the amount of struggle one puts into it. For he who struggled with the world became great by conquering the world, and he who struggled with himself became great by conquering himself. But he who struggled with God became greatest of all. So you can sort of wrestle with yourself over little things, but when you struggle with God, this most core part of oneself, you can become the greatest person of all, because there is no greater struggle than the sort of psychological quest to understand one's being existentially, let's say, to work at becoming a person and really having nothing at all to sort of base that on, sort of going into what these writers are going to consider the abyss, which is that darkness that has no guarantees, let's say. And it ends like this. It's a quote of Kierkegaard's. He says, that man was not an exegetical scholar. He did not know Hebrew. In other words, this is not a great learned academician. If he had known Hebrew, he perhaps would have easily understood the story of Abraham. Now, what interests Kierkegaard is the problem that is placed before Abraham in the biblical story where he has to risk everything for reasons that he can't ever fathom, that he simply has to base it all on faith. For in the story, God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. And remember, this is not only his only son, it is a son he thought he would never have. This is a blessing God has bestowed upon him, but God is asking him now to sacrifice Isaac. And so in Kierkegaard's book, he said Abraham has gained a prescriptive right to be a great man, so that what he does is great, and when another does the same thing, it's a sin. In other words, killing your son is, in terms of the ethical community, undoubtedly a sin. What Abraham is being asked to do is wrong in the eyes of his fellow men. Kierkegaard says the ethical expression of what Abraham did is that he meant to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he meant to sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction is the anxiety that can make a person sleepless. And yet, without this anxiety, Abraham is not who he is. And so, are we to think of, Kierkegaard's point is, are we to think of Abraham as a murderer when he, or a will-be murderer when he takes Isaac up the mountain? Or are we to think of him as someone who is obedient to God? And this, of course, comes up all the time in contemporary news stories when someone says, God instructed me to such and such. And one is thinking, is this person just crazy? Are they using God talk to justify their own desires? Or is there really such a thing as God, and is God telling them to do that? Now, in one sense, the concern is not whether there really is a God that's telling you to do that. The concern is whether you have faith in what you perceive to be God telling you to do that. So, what Kierkegaard is saying is, from Abraham's point of view, is he going to be a knight of faith who, with fear and trembling, is going to take his only son up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him because he has heard God say as much. Now, Isaac doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know he's being taken up there for that, and Sarah doesn't know. So he's basically taking his son without anyone knowing or against everyone's will. And so the question is whether we have a crazy murderer on our hands, the old man has just lost his mind, or whether he's genuinely listening to either the voice of God or the voice that he feels is God. So Kierkegaard wanted to understand the anxiety that must have been present in Abraham when, quote, God tested him and said to him, take Isaac, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on the mountain that I shall show you. Now, after dealing with the ordeal faced by Abraham, Kierkegaard presents the problems raised by the story, problems concerning the relation of ethics in a community, to what Kierkegaard sees as genuine religiosity, that is, doing what's required of you by God, even if it runs counter to what is morally acceptable by the community. Because remember, what he's suggesting is that we not simply respond to what the people around us think is right. Now, we might all in our everyday ways of thinking regard Abraham as crazy. But if you're in that position yourself, it's radically different. You've been told by God to do a particular something or other. Are you going to obey God, or are you just going to do whatever others expect of you? What Kierkegaard then does is present us with three problems. The first, he puts this way: is there what he calls a teleological suspension of the ethical? And by that he means, is there a way to suspend normal ethics in order to do what the Greeks would have called your telos, your individual purpose? So is there ever a time when it's okay to ignore or go against ethical concerns in order to do what one thinks is really right? Is there, as he puts it in the second question, an absolute duty to God which would trump anything that's normally considered ethically right. So Abraham had to choose between the ethical requirements of his surroundings and what he regarded as his absolute duty to God. At the end, Kierkegaard asks, was it ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal this from his wife Sarah or from his son Isaac? Now, they're obviously part of the community as well in one sense, but these are people that he loves, and in one case, he's actually going to kill the person, and to the other, he's going to take her only son. So the task that God gave to him, Abraham, was so horrifying that he could tell no one about it because no one would understand him. Everyone would have tried to talk him out of it. So ethics forbade it as well as aesthetics. Obviously, it was not a pleasing thing to Abraham. Abraham became what Kierkegaard calls a knight of faith because he was willing to do what God asked of him. Quote, he didn't trouble anyone with his suffering. Abraham was wrong as far as ethics is concerned, but right as far as the absolute is concerned. Kierkegaard says, wishing to be in the wrong is an expression of an infinite relationship, and wanting to be in the right, or finding it painful to be wrong, is an expression of a finite relationship. Hence, it is what Kierkegaard calls upbuilding, always to be in the wrong, because only the infinite builds up, the finite does not. So, in one sense, we want to be what he's here calling in the wrong because we want to be always at odds in order to keep this anxiety, this fear and trembling alive. Again, once we're just going through the motions or can just go through the motions, we're not genuinely existing in this sort of authentic sense. So what was the most that Abraham could do in his relationship with God? Remain faithful to his commitment to God. He accomplished that by actually lifting the knife with the intention of carrying out his mission. In short, he acted. Here the intention was more important than the result. He had faith and had to go no further to please God because, of course, in the story, God sends down an angel and says, hold up, you don't have to do this. What was important to God was that you show that you were willing and ready to do it. And so at the point when he's just about to kill Isaac, God stays his hand because what mattered is what was in Abraham's heart or mind, his intention. And in a passage from Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard writes, temporality, finitude, this is what it is all about. I can resign everything by my own strength and find peace and rest in the pain. I can put up with everything, even if that dreadful demon, more horrifying than the skeletal one who terrifies me, even if madness held its fool's costume before my eyes and I understood from its face that it was I who should put it on, I can still save my soul as long as my concern is that of my love of God. Conqueror within me is greater than my concern that I achieve earthly happiness. So, almost in the sense that we saw with Socrates, if my concern is always with being genuine or true to myself, I can't really go wrong. There's no particular content to the claim here. We don't know just what any given individual at any given time will feel is necessary for them to do. But Kierkegaard is saying, in effect, if one feels that it's right, then one has to be true to that feeling, regardless of the ramifications, the impact it's going to have on others, which could be painful even to oneself, but one's got to do, so to speak, what one feels one has to do. And few things illustrate this as well in Kierkegaard's own life as his relationship to a woman named Regina Olsen, whose dates you have here. She obviously outlived Kierkegaard by quite a bit. Kierkegaard had to make the choice, the real choice, that he's portraying in his books. And this is considered to be a major influence on his work, but it's also, he probably felt a part of the work itself, the actual doing of this. And so he had an engagement with Regina and broke it. And they met, were instantly attracted to each other, but he began to have second thoughts. And any relationship can be that way. Someone can think, well, this is not the gal for me, or this is not the guy for me. But that's not the nature of his problem. He had formally proposed to Regina, but he's beginning to think of this idea of entering into the contract of marriage as the institutionalizing of the ethical. And if he's going to be true to himself in one sense, as Socrates had said, he has to remain an individual. Socrates had been asked why he didn't run for public office or that kind of thing, and he said that in the Apology, he said that one has to remain a private individual in order that one can be objective and say what one wants, etc., and is not beholden to people to express the opinions that they want expressed. And that's very much the kind of thing that Kierkegaard is doing here. Only this time it means his own personal happiness. Instead of having a life with this woman and having a family and all that, he's got to be the individual. And he can't just write about it, because he understands that just like being an authentic Christian, if one is going to do this, one really has to do it. So Kierkegaard is using the story of Abraham to help himself understand his relationship with Regina. She was his only love as far as the finitude that he keeps talking about is concerned, and he gave her up. So he's no longer finitely concerned about her, and precisely this move, he feels, makes a movement of what he calls infinite faith, because this has, so to speak, infinite consequences, absolute consequences. He's making an either-or kind of choice about how his own life is going to go. And so he said his love for Regina was beautiful and healthy, but not perfect, and he gave it up in order to serve God, was his way of putting it, which would be a choice of at least aspiring toward a life of perfection. Now, after giving us the tale of Abraham in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard writes the book Stages on Life's Way, where he's doing something like continuing the more theoretical, let's say, work that he had been doing with Either Or. And so where in Either Or he had contrasted the aesthetic with the ethical, he's now sort of showing that the stages on long life's way are going to continue to the religious. It is Kierkegaard's concern was to present the various stages of existence in one's work if possible. In other words, he thought to the extent that one can spell out what's involved in the religious, he's going to try, because it's very easy to sort of make clear what the aesthetic is, to make clear what the ethical is. But when we're talking about the religious, because we're talking about the personal and so the unique, there's only so much that can be explicated theoretically. It's the reason that, one of the reasons Kierkegaard is against the whole notion of philosophical systems, because they don't get at what's most individual. They can't get at what's most individual and don't aspire to. If one's living a religious life, one has to do it oneself, and so a book about how to do that is, in effect, necessarily out of the question. Now, part of what he writes could be interpreted as accusations against himself regarding Regina Olsen, the kind of accusations that the public might have made against Abraham. In other words, he's aware of how stupid it sometimes surely feels to himself, but would definitely seem to others. And he admits that, quote, he's really no religious individuality. I'm just a regular and perfectly constructed possibility of such a person. With a sword hanging over my head in peril of my life, I discover the religious crisis with a primitivity such as if I had not known them before, with such a primitivity that if they had not been, I would have to discover them. So what he's saying is that this throws me into a situation where I have to take this seriously in the way that Pascal had showed us that the wager has to be. So Kierkegaard has already said that he wasn't any of his the authors that were listed as pseudonyms, yet in some way he thinks of himself as being them all. So all of this criticism of himself is meant to be shown as part of his own self-understanding or part of his self-formation. And so in this guilt that he feels when he's making these criticisms, he asks, what similarity is there between her sorrow and mine? What solidarity is there between guilt and innocence? What kinship is there between repentance and an aesthetic sorrow over life? When that which awakens repentance is that which awakens her sorrow. I can sorrow in my way. If she must sorrow, she must also do it on her own account. A girl may submit to a man in many things, but not in the ethical. And it is unethical for her and for me to sorrow jointly in this way. Taking this path, how will she ever come to sorrow religiously when she must leave undecided an ethical issue, such as my behavior toward her, when it is indeed over its result that she wishes to sorrow? Would that I might be a woman for half a year, so that I could learn how she is dissimilar to man. Now, in one sense, he's saying she has got to do this herself as well. She does go on to marry someone else and have a family and all that, but she could, of course, decide to do something like what Kierkegaard's doing and become this authentic individual by sort of living in fear and trembling. But and of course, if we all do that kind of thing, there's no more people in a generation or two. But what Kierkegaard is saying is, I don't know what it's like to be in her shoes. She may take what she thinks to be my view of things seriously, or the views of others around her seriously, but ultimately she has to do for herself what I'm doing for myself. And part of the problem that I can't know is what it's like to be female, and nor she what it's like to be male. And so it's those contingencies that go to make up a self with which each person has to struggle. We can't make a prescription for everyone because no one's life is exactly the same, and one's gender is, of course, just one of the ways in which they can vary. So we can spell out the details of the stages, at least to a point. For the aesthetic, it's defined by immediacy, the failure to reflect seriously on one's way of living. I just want the pleasure. The aesthetic sees the outer existence as more important. The self is entirely subject to external factors. If there's something enjoyable here, then I want to get it. The aesthetic accepts passively that one's life is based entirely upon external factors. In other words, it doesn't bother me. I'm totally okay with just doing this. The aesthetic tends to avoid commitments because they can get in the way of one's pleasures, and may even see them as boring. Because then it means you don't get to try new flavors. The exhaustion of aesthetic pleasure, Kierkegaard feels, will lead to boredom and despair. He thinks that at some point it's likely that anyone should sort of tire of this way of living. When they mature, we might say, and turn to the ethical and think of others, it gets defined by critical reflection, and the ethical person is able to take moral responsibility for his or her life choices. They see the inner experiences as more important. The self shapes its own character, values, inclinations, etc. In other words, we start to think of ourselves as a self who, in order to take responsibility and think about how we act with respect to others, has to sort of turn in on themselves more. They're willing to take control of their lives, to use a little self-discipline. They see commitments like friendship and marriage as cornerstones of that responsible way of living. And they strive to become a better person. And here there would be striving, because you have to use some self-discipline and tell yourself from time to time that while the aesthetic pleasures are there, you might have to turn them away in order to fulfill some commitment to other people. But when we pass to the religious stage, we have to experience something of a leap, something that's been come to be called a leap of faith. Once an individual has leaped into the religious, it's as though one can never really stay there in a fixed sense. It's not as if we can go from stage 1 to 2 to 3 and then we're good. The religious awakening is an infinite and terrible experience, the kind that we saw with Abraham. Terrible because it has no recourse to the normal conventions that usually govern one's life. The great thing about moral institutions and rules is that they sort of give us guidelines and borders and fences to negotiate our way with. We can use reason, rational inquiry, and objective analysis there. None of these faculties that work so well in the first two stages has any meaning in the final. One has entered a higher realm of existence that's attainable on earth as a human being, but one that's marked by paradox. In other words, as we saw with Abraham, the paradoxical nature of the religious experience is seen in the way in which it can, so to speak, be communicated. It can't be discussed rationally and logically analyzed, but the most profound event in one's life and the meaning one feels can only be sort of inferred. It's one of the reasons why, not just with Kierkegaard, but with a lot of the people we'll be looking at, we're dealing with writings that are indirect, that even do the kind of thing where he's discussing several aspects in different characters, personae, because in one sense, one can't say exactly what's involved in the religious stage. One can intuit it, experience it, but its communicability is possible only in this indirect way. Thus, one enters the religious realm as something like subjective truth. To be in a state of subjective truth is truly to be an individual for Kierkegaard. It's a highly personal mode of existence. A religious person is only truly an existing individual when this stage is attained. And so when you get there, it's, again, not as if you've crossed a finish line. You've entered a realm where you're never really at ease. You're always, and always should be, feeling this dreadful anxiety. So in one sense, we might ask, why would anyone want to do that? Why couldn't you just live a comfortable life with Regina? But the religious person becomes aware of his own individuality in a way that's impossible while he's still at the ethical stage, because there you're just complying with rules set by the community. It's as if the blinders are removed from one's eyes and one is able to see oneself in a completely new way. So consequently, everyone sees everyone else as an individual as well, or at least as a potential individual in this religious sense. Like Socrates, Kierkegaard is suggesting that to really know oneself is to know oneself as an individual. If you remember, Socrates' motto was to know oneself. So to be an individual is to be a subject and not an object. I don't think of myself as a thing, or even as whatever my name is. I think of myself as an ongoing process that I constantly have to take up and be involved in. So to exist subjectively means not to objectify others. It means more to realize that somewhere in there is something like what you're going through. And that's why you can get the sense of real religiosity being a concern with others, but not in the ethical sense of doing nice things for one another, but in recognizing others as children of God who are potentially faced with this same dread and anxiety themselves. Now here's a very simplistic view of the stages on life's way. If you look at the outer circle, it's aesthetic, the next one is the ethical, and the core of this is religious. Now, while this is a simplification of it, you'll notice that it doesn't ascend from bottom to top. Rather, it sort of comes in from outside to one's inner core. So we're talking about an inwardness where one goes from aesthetic pleasure to concern with doing the right thing ethically to suddenly this inner core where there is no real direction and where what Kierkegaard is calling true religiosity begins. Because here one's thrown back upon oneself and has to figure out for oneself what one thinks is really right, or so to speak, what God wants. Now, this takes us back to the part I mentioned earlier where Kierkegaard is at odds with system builders like Kant and Hegel, but especially Hegel. Hegel had suggested that there are stages along life's way, but it's stages in spirits, that is Geists, or the universal mind's way, rather than any particular individual's way. So in Hegel's system, everybody kind of falls in place as part of a larger whole. But for Kierkegaard, that leaves the individual completely unacknowledged. It's and undone, let's say. And so in a book he wrote in around the same time as the earlier one, 1846, called Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, he writes a work that is, as it says here, a postscript to a book he had written earlier called Philosophical Fragments. That book is actually pretty small. This one is the postscript that he writes to the earlier book is actually much bigger than the original book. But there he's explaining all the reasons why he's against Hegel's system and systematizing generally. Because in one sense you can think of that as, and you could even think of the theology of Christianity as missing the point, precisely because it's concerned with the system and not with each individual as an individual. So what he does there is to contrast objectivity that's to be found in systems like Hegel's, or at least ostensibly, and of course definitely in Western science, with the subjectivity that he's concerned with and that he thinks comes through most, or best, let's say, through religious experience. And so while one entails direct communication, that is, simply calling things as one sees them or as the community sees them, that is scientific objectivity, the other requires indirect communication. Because if I'm going to get to this idea, it's never going to be by spelling out exactly in what it consists. And that goes not just for when I communicate it to other people or try, but even when I communicate it to myself, I have to kind of speak around it as I near the core of my being. Because in effect, I'm creating that core as I try to understand or comprehend it. In fact, it's one of the reasons why expressions like I just used, or religious talk in general, sounds so ridiculous many times. Because it isn't literally saying what it means to say, or what it, so to speak, has in mind. It's trying to get at something that language can't, is kind of what Kierkegaard's suggesting. Now, he's most famous for the term a leap of faith. It's commonly attributed to him. He referred to a leap to faith. Remember, he's writing in Danish. But he's thinking of it as something like this circular leap toward one's core, which is made by faith. So it's, rather than being a leap of faith, which he never actually wrote, he never wrote that expression, he's saying something like a leap to and by faith. So faith is doing the work, and it's a leap into faith. So it's not grounded in any conscious sense. It's just simply taking it on, and really no word works better than the word faith. In Concluding Unscientific Postscript, he describes the core part of the leap. Quote, thinking can turn toward itself in order to think about itself, and skepticism can emerge. But this thinking about itself never accomplishes anything. So Kierkegaard is saying that thinking should serve by thinking something. Kierkegaard wants to stop, quote, thinking's self-reflection. And that's the movement that constitutes a leap. He's against people thinking about religion all day without ever doing anything. But he's also against external shows and opinions about religion and in favor of the internal movement of faith. So he says, where Christianity wants to have inwardness, worldly Christendom wants outwardness. And where Christianity wants outwardness, worldly wisdom wants inwardness. In other words, the show of being a Christian is not enough, and just talking about it or thinking about it is not enough. You've got to actually do something, which he did in his case with Regina, but that alone is not it. You also have to do it in a certain way, in an authentic, genuine way. As he says, the less externality, the more inwardness, if it is truly there. But it's also the case that the less externality, the greater the possibility that the inwardness will entirely fail to come. The externality is the watchman who awakens the sleeper. The externality is the solicitous mother who calls one. The externality is the roll call that brings the soldier to his feet. The externality is the reveille that helps one to make the great effort. But the absence of the externality can mean that the inwardness itself calls inwardly to a person. Alas, but it can also mean that the inwardness will fail to come. So it's not as if you have a guarantee from one side or the other. The the motions that you go through can help awaken you to your genuine religiosity, but they can also just keep you going through the motions. So he says the most dreadful thing of all is a personal existence that cannot coalesce in a conclusion. In other words, conviction is what's wanted, and a conviction based on faith, not knowledge. So the leap of faith is Kierkegaard's conception of how an individual would believe in God or how a person would act when in love. Faith is not a decision based on evidence that, say, certain beliefs about God are true or a certain person is worthy of love. Right? We don't ever, when we love someone, we don't say, here's all the reasons why you're worthy for my love. It's something one takes on faith. So if you think of the comparison between thoughts about God and being in love with someone, he thinks no such evidence could ever be enough to completely justify the kind of total commitment involved in true religious faith or romantic love. Faith involves making that commitment anyway. Kierkegaard thought that to have faith is the same time to have doubt. So, for example, for one to truly have faith in God, one would also have to have doubt about one's belief in God. That's not a bad thing. It's a necessary part of it. The doubt is the rational part of a person's thought involved in weighing the evidence, without which the faith would have no real substance. So someone who doesn't realize that Christian doctrine is inherently doubtful and that there can be no objective certainty about its truth does not have faith, but is merely credulous, that is, merely believing out of habit or going along with it. For example, it takes no faith to believe that a pencil or a table exists when one is looking at it and touching it. In the same way, to believe or to have faith in God is to know that one has no perceptual or any other access to God, and yet still has faith in God. So, in effect, what he's saying is, you may not be able to perceive it like an object outside yourself, but that's actually better. It's not something you can know, and if you could, it would be a lesser thing. The faith, the sheer quaking in your boots about whether or not you're right, is precisely what makes it so incredible to him. And that leads us to the sort of his conception of truth is subjectivity, or that subjectivity is itself truth. He stresses the importance of the self as much as anyone, and we're going to see that that's common to the existentialists. The self's relation to the world, and as well as, let's say, self-reflection and introspection. So it's not as if one lives only inside one's own head. The process of introspection and self-reflection include one's dealings with things around oneself, just as Abraham's had. He argued in concluding Unscientific Postscript that subjectivity is truth and truth subjectivity. This has to do with the distinction between what is objectively true and an individual's subjective relation to that truth. So people who in some sense believe the same things may relate to those things quite differently. Two individuals may both believe that many of those around them are poor and deserve help, but this knowledge may lead only one of them to decide to actually help. This is how Kierkegaard put it, quote, "What a priceless invention statistics are, what a glorious fruit of culture, what a characteristic counterpart to the tale told about you of antiquity." Yet, he says, with the help of all the statistical tables, one laughs at all of life. And in effect, what he's saying is, statistics will help sort of decide the median. We'll know what the average person thinks or does and whatnot, but it's actually making a mockery of life itself, because no one is ever those statistics or ever that average. One is always just oneself. So that leads into the other part of this claim, which is basically that the crowd is untruth. If subjectivity is truth, then the crowd, the masses, the majority of people, is the problem. So as he puts it, truth always rests with the minority. And the minority is always stronger than the majority because the minority is generally formed by those who really have an opinion, while the strength of a majority is illusory, formed by the gangs who have no opinion, and who therefore, in the next instant, when it's evident that the minority is the stronger, assume its opinion, which then becomes that of the majority, i.e. becomes nonsense by having the whole on its side, while truth again reverts to a new minority. In other words, as Socrates had said, there are some who sort of really know what's going on, and then what Kierkegaard's calling the majority here adopt that opinion, but blindly. They simply are putting their stamp of approval on it and going with it. And it means that some new minority has always got to come up with the real opinion, because the majority is always simply going to mouth what had been accepted earlier. Which leads to this last quote, which is rather long, but as you can see, it concerns the individual, which is Kierkegaard's ultimate concern. And he says, being an individual man is a thing that has been abolished, and every speculative philosopher confuses himself with humanity at large, whereby he becomes something infinitely great, and at the same time nothing at all. In other words, one inflates one's opinion as if it were some general principle. To be a particular individual is world historically absolutely nothing, infinitely nothing. And yet, this is the only true and highest significance of a human being, so much higher as to make every other significance illusory. If initially my human nature is merely an abstract something, it is at any rate the task which life sets me to become subjective. The uncertainty of death becomes more and more to interpenetrate my subjectivity dialectically. It thus becomes more and more important for me to think it in connection with every factor and phase of my life. For since the uncertainty is there in every moment, it can be overcome only by overcoming it in every moment. An objective uncertainty held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness is the truth, the highest truth attainable for an existing individual. All knowledge about reality is possibility. The only reality to which an existing individual may have a relation that is more than cognitive is his own reality. The fact that he exists, this reality constitutes his absolute interest. In other words, there is nothing more important than becoming oneself. And my awareness of death, which is a major theme in religion, becomes an asset, you might say. It actually informs my life and makes me think every moment is up for grabs. The coin that Pascal spoke of in the last lecture is being flipped constantly. And I'm going to be there each time to see how it comes out and to help it come out in the way that I think best, or to appropriate whatever contingencies life throws at me and make them my own. And so Kierkegaard is saying one's most important obligation is to become a self, to become an individual. And that's ultimately the reason for Kierkegaard's attack upon Christendom. Not just the book, but how he spent the last several years of his life, really his whole life. But what he's thinking, I mean, if we hear someone making an attack on Christendom, we would think, well, there's someone who's an atheist. But Kierkegaard is basically saying it's this going through the motion, this sort of facade of Christianity that is the worst for the genuine Christian. In one sense, the atheist is more invigorating to the theist or the would-be Christian, because there you've got a genuine threat. With Christendom, at least his view of it, institutionalized Christianity, he's seeing it as the palest of existence, sort of walking through life without ever really paying attention. In his own lifetime, this work was published in a series of articles, newspaper articles in a periodical called The Fatherland, and then in self-published pamphlets. And this is how seriously he's taking it. He's proselytizing this notion of individuality. In pamphlets he called The Moment, or The Instant, however you want to translate it from the Danish. And they're all collected here as this attack upon Christendom. And here's a picture of the Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen, that his actions, his pamphlets and stuff were all centered around. He doesn't have anything against the external trappings if they help one to become more genuine and thoughtful about one's self, the way he's framing it, one's Christianity. But if it's just a matter of going to church and dressing nicely and showing other people that you're doing those things as they show you you're doing those things, it's really just another form of modern culture. And he sees it as sort of a falling away from what's really involved in the kind of thing we saw with Abraham. And as I mentioned at the outset, Kierkegaard didn't live a long life. And when he died, he was in a hospital, and he had been there for about a month, and no one knows exactly why he died. They think it may be complications from a fall he had taken when he was young. We just don't know in retrospect. But when he was buried, he was buried in this Assistens Kierkegaard. As you can see, the churchyard, the graveyard, is basically the same name as his. So it's sort of a life lived with this awareness of death and where one's headed ultimately and all that stuff. But at his funeral, a nephew of his, who's been instrumental in sort of detailing his life afterwards, caused a disturbance by protesting that Kierkegaard was being buried by the official church, and this nephew maintained that Kierkegaard would never have approved of that. That when he was alive, he had broken from and denounced the institution, and so and that it was such a disturbance that the nephew was removed and fined for it for disruption of a funeral. But in one sense, the nephew had it right. What Kierkegaard had wanted on his tombstone ultimately was simply the individual. And if you look at this, this is the family, the Kierkegaard plot here. Kierkegaard is buried in the lower left. The bottom part of the lower left there is Soren Kierkegaard's place. And what's written on his grave, the epitaph reads in Danish, "It's very little time that I have gained. Then it is the whole struggle vanished at once, and I can rest in hails of roses and endlessly talk to my Jesus." Now, that is not at all what he had wanted. He wanted simply on his tombstone to read the individual, and the wish was not granted. So family pressures, the ethical stuff, in the end won out, both with him being buried there and it not saying what he wanted said, which of course shows us that in some cases the individual could be wrong, at least when judged by the community. If Abraham had killed Isaac, wouldn't it be an old crazy man who had murdered his son? And so while we understand retrospectively Kierkegaard's claims about the nature of the individual, and each have to struggle with it as he did, we also have to struggle with our involvement in communities and realize that anytime we claim that God wants us to do something or other people are going to be saying, well, that's not what God has told me, or are you sure you're not just crazy, and so on. So in the end, Kierkegaard's individuality ran right into the larger community and the sort of the situation with which one has to deal with. If one dies, there's no telling what's going to happen, whether one's wishes will be fulfilled or whatnot, which is, of course, one of the things he's telling us, that while one is alive every day to appropriate that, to carpe diem, so to speak, to seize the day and make of one's life what one will.